Hello. Welcome to Nikita's house. We could not do the Wi-Fi at our cafe, so we moved here. I have 0 viewers. Where are my viewers?
Hold on a second.
Yeah, get your shit together, guys. Yeah, 0 viewers. Maybe they went on and then they... Welcome to Nikita's house. We could not do the Wi-Fi at our cafe, so we moved here. I have 0 viewers. Where are my viewers? Yeah. Maybe they went on.
So everybody's getting it now.
But there's
feedback. That might be feedback from the other viewers.
But this says there are no viewers.
Oh.
Oh, I see the video.
Okay.
See if you can join or something.
Yeah.
This is just you looping, listening to yourself.
Yeah. So.
Gil, are you cool sitting there? You know,
Oh yeah, I don't care.
sit there.
Well, I just want to get this thing working. So.
Just holler if you need it.
Okay. Thanks, man. I was going to try to post something on Facebook saying we're taking some time.
Oh yeah, this is live. Cool.
So now you're seeing. Okay. All right.
Good.
It's catching up.
Six viewers.
Alright.
All right.
What's happening?
Can I see who's viewing? Can I?
Yeah, they're in, dude.
They're here? Okay.
All right. Can I see who's viewing?
Settings. Okay, I wanted to set up this Q&A so I could kind of see who's here. This feature is disabled. You can turn this feature on and off on the Google Events page. Okay. Edit event.
Alright. I'm in.
You're in. Okay, I'm trying to edit the event. Maybe I can't.
I want to set up this Q&A so you can
Yeah, you can't see anyone.
Dan Gonzalez is in.
Oh, okay. Hold on a second. I'm going to try to start it again.
These are all like just 2 or 3 minute old notes.
You should have just lost me, right? And now I'm coming back.
I have a backlog. I just watched you take your jacket off.
Okay.
Just now.
This is crazy.
I see that you checked in just now, but
Okay, that was barely a minute ago, so that's cool.
All right, it's loading. It might be taxing the Wi-Fi here now.
I should hope not. This is all we're doing to the Wi-Fi. Be like, why are you people taking so much money from me every month?
Why is it so slow? Come on. Loading.
Do you think it'll help if you have earphones?
I think I wouldn't be able to hear myself, and I would be on that
I'm
loop.
curious if I get it.
well, there's no need for us three to hear you through there.
That's true. You guys don't really need to be online once we've got the one thing going.
Yeah.
That's true.
I mean, I'd love to see myself.
Where to see the other?
Speaking of
We can watch
Uncanny
from that
Valley.
video, yeah, that's true. We can just watch from that phone.
Or we could just all watch on this screen, and then we wouldn't tax the Wi-Fi the same way. I can't believe how long it's taking this thing to just like load the stupid page.
Oh yeah, the broadcast is about 30 seconds behind what we just said.
Okay.
But where are the folks? Say hello, folks.
Oh, shit, that's probably the problem right there.
Oh, it's Command and then the button above Tab. It's like the tilde button. Did that work?
Hey guys,
Okay.
we're working on making this work. Have you got sound now? Live video calls. This technology is not entirely within our control, which seems appropriate
As
to
usual.
talk about Frankenstein. So I don't know what you guys can hear of me, how much you can understand of what I'm saying, how much of the delay or overlap there is.
Field to
Have
chime
you got
in.
sound now?
Totally.
Live video.
Okay. Today I sent out a handout that has some of the early events that are concurrent to the composing of Frankenstein.
Talk about Frankenstein. So I don't know if you guys can hear me, how much I understand what I'm saying, how much
Try muting
delay
it.
or overlap there is.
Mute.
Just so you don't.
So, click this. Mute microphone.
I don't know if I want to hit you.
Check, check.
Okay, your mic's still working. You just don't have to hear it.
Okay, we have to fix some of that horrible looping that we were experiencing. I still don't know what you guys are saying, so hopefully some of my buddies can help me out. Oh, I know I don't have my paperwork that has all the dates of the different things that happened. We have the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, specifically the Luddite Revolution, which happened in England. We have the founding of America with the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration with the Revolution in France, the Declaration of Human Rights. So clearly people are thinking about what is the status of a human being, how does the government protect that status, how does the government share power with its citizenry, all that important stuff. So it's not as if Mary Shelley is just inventing a ghost story to fit a weekend bet, but she's positioning the ghost story within the early beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And because she's doing that, I think it makes it more than just a ghost story. Specifically, it's obviously a kind of an allegory. This is probably for Mary Shelley not a science fiction novel, but a Gothic novel. And when we mean that is a novel that might properly be thought of as the precursor to the pulps, a kind of sensational, radically different kind of literature, much more designed to titillate and entertain rather than being just a source of enlightenment values or whatever. In addition, the Gothic novel, when you study it, you can see this consistent use of distance, right? So like that explains why the Frankenstein novel begins with these letters coming from the North Pole and so forth. The way Aldous explains it in his Billion Year Spree is that the Gothics felt that if you're going to write something truly, outside of the realm of ordinary experience, that action should be placed outside of the realm of ordinary experience so that the people reading it can't compare what's happening in the story to their own experiences. So it's really a kind of radical way of thinking about fiction, and it's a fairly a far cry from our sort of mimetic fiction nowadays. It's based on accurately replicating the universe as we experience it. Blah blah blah. Again, it's difficult to know kind of how much of this you're picking up, how well this is going, but I want to talk a little bit about the precursors to Gothic fiction. We have Erasmus Darwin, who writes something called Zoonomia in 1794 and 1796. It's a kind of early evolutionary text that talks about sexual selection, talks about primeval promiscuity. So you can get the sense that nature is red in tooth and claw, but nature is also horny in tooth and claw, if you know what I mean. The next really important text actually predates that, is The Castle of Otranto, 1765, Horace Walpole. Wikipedia tells us the first edition of this novel purported to be a translation based on a manuscript printed at Naples in 1529 and recently rediscovered in the library of, quote, an ancient Catholic family in the north of England. So this story is told almost entirely in secondary documents, and that makes it a very close thematic cousin to Frankenstein. Additionally, one of the things we want to talk about with the Gothic genre is this notion of the sublime. So Edmund Burke distinguished between beauty, right, which is just something that we find pleasure and placid enjoyment in, and the sublime, which inspires awe and terror, with pain as its basis, and it disturbs the emotions. So the kind of hard thing to think about is how radical an idea that was. Like, we think of texts that disturb the emotions as really common, as being a sort of central conceit of literature. Is, you know, it's a shit disturbing enterprise. But not originally. You know, originally I think a lot of the texts were designed to perpetrate order rather than to shake up the given order. So this idea that a fiction would be dedicated to disturbing the emotions was really radical, and it really sets up the genre of science fiction as we want to understand it. So when somebody's encountering the sublime, it's like they're so overwhelmed by what they're experiencing that their normal ability to rationally contemplate what they're seeing is sort of short-circuited. And because of that, they're in a kind of well, their minds are being blown, right? And if you think about Phil Dick, you can see that it's not a far leap. What Edmund Burke says is, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it's productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. So think about this, like, instead of thinking about the feelings that we can inspire through literature being like our love of God, love of country, love of order, here we have this terror, this abject, ill-feeling, ill-fitting notion that is the sort of primary currency of the genre. It's pretty important. I want to make an argument that...
Can you repeat that concept? You said it was a genre meant to disturb something?
Yeah, well, I think that literature in the past, before the Gothic era, it had been enjoyed only by really the most privileged of the society. And so as literacy is sort of trickling down to the masses, the things that they're choosing to read are different, and rather than reading the Bible, which is inspiring, you know, our devotion to God or whatever, filial piety or something, right, here we have a literature just dedicated to just disturbing us, to tweaking us, to making us feel uncomfortable. That's radically different, and something that, as 21st century, you know, fans of fiction, we can't really appreciate, I don't think. But it's an incredibly important concept, and you can see this. One of the things is, where is the sublime in Frankenstein? And unfortunately, I don't have any pages marked out. I hope to develop this in the next few days, but it's the descriptions of nature. These when he meets Frankenstein on the top of the mountain, the description of the peaks as being imposing in a way that you know, changes the way you feel physically. Now, that's the encounter with the sublime. Where you're physically, your way you encounter reality is just sort of tweaked and overwhelmed by what you see. That's a really important argument. I'd like to move from that to the idea, first the argument that this is a science fiction novel, that Mary Shelley unintentionally, while writing a Gothic novel, may have written the first science fiction novel. There's a couple of things arguing in favor of that. One is that really the narrative is centered around a technology that didn't exist at the time that she wrote the book. That is, the reanimation of dead corpses. was still science fiction to us, although we're closer to being able to do that with CPR and all that kind of stuff. But not only is the narrative centered on a technological innovation, but the moral implications of that technological improvement are center stage. So it's not just a question of what's invented, but what are the moral consequences and ramifications of that invention. And because of that, I think it can make the argument that this is science fiction. Now, I'd be curious to kind of know what the rest of the readers think. I may have misread the book. I got the sense that when Victor gets to college, that the professor says, these alchemists that you're into, that's old stuff, get out of that, and kind of dissuades him, but that the other professor, the second guy he meets, actually kind of encourages him to follow those pursuits into the Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa and all those guys. What Brian Aldiss says very explicitly in The Billion Year Spree, which if you haven't read that, you probably should, what he says is it's pretty obvious that Victor Frankenstein's studies take him from a path of alchemical investigation into basically the Enlightenment science of the 19th century, the 1800s. And that's the question I think is sort of one of the distinguishing features. Is this science fiction? Is the means by which the fiend is reanimated, are those scientific means, or are they alchemical occult means? And the first few times I read the book, I really was a believer in the occult. But all this makes a pretty good case, and I just have to go back and look at the second encounter with that professor, whether or not, if in fact the the primary advancements of Enlightenment science are what makes possible the reanimation of the fiend, that's fundamentally a different narrative than the rediscovery of ancient occult techniques are the way to reanimate this corpse.
Yeah, and it's a rediscovery.
And
that was his inspiration.
Okay, so he's coming from an inspiration of alchemy and occult, but he's using basic galvanism, electricity, and chemistry.
His chemistry set, he packs it and takes it with him.
It's true. Okay, all right. Well, I think we can make the argument then that basically, for Mary Shelley is making the point that the corpses and the fiend is animated with Enlightenment era science, and I think she's smart to never tell us really what that is.
But it's a combination of pre-Enlightenment, metaphysical thought,
Okay.
post-Enlightenment.
And I'm gonna find what that professor said. I remember what
Okay.
you're talking
Nikita's bringing up the point that it's a conflation or a combination of two forces that animate the fiend: an occult wisdom that is preserved from olden times and a new occult wisdom. That's something that I need to be really sure about before I teach this, because I think it makes pretty central points about the story. We need to just talk briefly about the idea of genre, not so much for this group of people that are reading here that know about genre, but to kind of get a sense for how to talk about genre. We're moving this table around.
For the light.
To these students. Now, my students in this class.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's much better. Thanks. My students in this class, this may be the only literature course they ever take in all of their college career. So, in addition to just showing them the canon of science fiction, we really have to talk about how does fiction work, what is genre, what is symbol, what are literary tropes. So, just to speak briefly about genre, I think genre is a loose collection or a loose confederation of traits that are used to categorize particular texts as coming from similar or working towards similar, coming from similar standpoints or working towards similar endpoints. But I think that we should really use a very loose idea about genre, that we shouldn't get too caught up in it. The interesting thing, of course, about genre is that while we think of Frankenstein as science fictional in genre, like I said earlier, Mary Shelley most likely thought of herself as writing in the Gothic genre. So what do we do when genres change through history after the writing of the text? How do we understand that? And I think that's something we should take pretty seriously.
Okay. The professor thinks.
Okay.
It's in the
third from the last paragraph.
Okay.
In chapter 3.
Let's take a read.
And it's right here, right when he names Agrippa and
Okay.
Paracelsus.
Okay, so here we are. We're in
He's talking
chapter.
to the chemistry teacher at this point.
We're in chapter 3, and we're talking to the second chemistry teacher at Ingolstadt. And he said he heard with attention the little narration concerning my studies, and smiled at the names of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, but without the contempt that M. Krempe had exhibited. He said that these were men to whose indefatigable zeal modern philosophers were indebted for most of the foundations of their knowledge. They had left to us as an easier task to give new names and arrange in connected classifications the facts which they in great degree had been the instruments of bringing to light. The labors of men of genius, however, erroneously directed, scarcely ever fail in ultimately turning to the solid advantage of mankind. So here, I don't think I was misreading
He's
this.
seeing them as part of a process, but the chemistry teacher feels like we've come a long way. Like
Yeah,
he still credits those guys.
yeah. Okay, so there's just a kind of traditionalism that you see in the second professor that the first professor doesn't have any time for. And Ted has gotten into this. Ted Hand has talked about the way in which the Romantics wanted to separate themselves from the ideas of the Enlightenment by looking back at earlier, more occult and alchemical texts as a kind of alternative to Enlightenment technology progression. Thanks for that, Suhail. So I think this is one of the things I really want some feedback on from readers at some point. When we get it all working, what is the connection between the animation of the fiend and Western Enlightenment scientific values?
Let me write that one.
Yeah. Okay. When we talk about a literary trope, what we mean is basically one of the tools that a writer has in his toolbox when he's writing. So we might mean symbolism, we might mean an allusion to another text, we might mean a particular literary tradition or a particular operation that the author carries out. For instance, in Frankenstein, one of the tropes you see is the use of secondary texts, the notion of the Gothic, that they're separating out the action of the story from where people normally encounter reality. In other words, this takes place in the far-flung plains of Switzerland and Italy rather than on the island of England or whatever. I think Frankenstein, if we're going to call it the first science fiction novel, sets up an interesting relationship between the idea of science and the idea of a fiction or a genre of literature dedicated to espousing its values. If Frankenstein is the first science fiction novel, well, it's a novel that is fundamentally, I think, anti-science, that tells us that we ought to be careful about what we create, that tells us that, yeah, it's a cautionary tale. And I think that that's what science fiction almost always is. One of the threads of the class is I want to really go up against Neal Stephenson's allegation that science fiction is insufficiently optimistic. I think that is without any kind of historical basis, and I think it displays a kind of blinding ignorance to the traditions in science fiction. I mean, if we were really to make a list, if we were to make two columns, pro and con, utopia and dystopian. If we were to really count out of science fiction's canon, how many of these visions of the future are utopian in nature, and how many of them are cautionary or dystopian? I don't think it would even be close. I think we'd have way more cautionary dystopian fictions than we have regular ones. And I think this is a kind of very fundamental idea that we're coming to, and it's I have it here in this quote. I hope. Such shall be the chastisement of that blind curiosity which would transgress those bounds the wisdom of the Creator has prescribed to human knowledge. Right, so this was really interesting to me, and I talked a lot about this when I was in graduate school. My interest in graduate school was looking at narratives in which man creates man. So it's the Golem tales, story of Frankenstein. There's Achilles makes a mechanized army at one point in the Odyssey. There's some really interesting ones. But without fail, the thing that binds all of these tales of man-made man together is the idea that when man makes man, he gets more than he bargained for. Right? So, for instance, my favorite story of the Golem, like after this Golem had been created to protect the ghetto, and after the ghetto was no longer threatened, what do you do with the Golem? Well, the rabbi says, go get the water from that well and take it to the house. The Golem drains the well until it's dry and floods the house. Like, you cannot control human beings. They subvert the control that you try to put on them.
And it goes into like how rudimentary AI development is.
It is,
How do you
yeah.
tell it nuance? How do you teach it human nuance?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay. I also kind of want to talk. I also want to recognize, especially for my students, like Frankenstein is a freaking slog, guys. It's a tough book, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
the one of the things that Suhail and I were talking about tonight that's so interesting is the fact that every person in the damn book sounds the same. You know, there's no voice difference between the narrator and the fiend and the dad and Elizabeth and Henry and everybody said Justine. They all sound the same. They all speak with that voice. There's no real use of like paragraphing or rhythm. There's just this endless sort of pontification and frenzied, digressive, telling of the tale. So I want the students to know, like, this is a hard book to read because the fiction, the literature, the genre has changed so much, and because probably we value this book more for what it is than how it accomplishes what it accomplishes. You know,
Yeah, it stands for.
what it stands for, what it ends up being as our sort of first. Story of man making man is much more important than, the way that it utilizes the Gothic tactics of distance or whatever. Like, as Brian Aldiss says, imagine if Mary Shelley had been a great writer rather than just a good one. What would we be talking about today in relation to this book? So, that's one reason I'm reluctant to have the students slog through the book, especially since there's so much science fiction that they're going to enjoy reading, more than this. But at the same time, like, it's really important that they have this basic grounding in a sense of this is where the genre started. This is, all the roads in some ways lead back to this, and that's because in this narrative there's both technological center and there's an ethical, moral contemplation taking place. To me, I don't see science fiction as existing with only one of those two. I think science fiction has to really have both in order to qualify, at least to be good.
Both of what?
It has to have both a technological innovation and it has to have a moral speculation about the ramifications of that creation. Now, one of the things we could talk about is science fiction optimistic. Is this literature of the future, or is this a way of impugning or castigating man for ambition, for playing God? Is science fiction optimistic, or is it ultimately cautionary? And can we make claims like that? Probably we can't make big claims, but certainly if this is the foundation of science fiction, we can't think of science fiction as a genre dedicated to celebrating technological advances. We could only maybe say science fiction is a genre dedicated to the possible moral ramifications of technological advancement. I want to talk more about the precursors. I've done some thinking. One of the hypotheses that I want to put forward in the class and discuss is whether or not one of the prerequisites for science fiction to exist is a kind of rate of progress, a certain rate of progress. Like 500 years ago, the rate of technological progress was so slow that it may not have been possible for human beings to imagine it. But as that progress has accelerated, and every study that we've done of technological progress shows that it speeds up, that as these advancements come, each one closer on the heels of its predecessor, then the human writer artist, the making up the story has the ability to foresee the next technological invention. So one of the reasons that I want to place Frankenstein as one of the first science fictional novels is because before that, the rate of scientific increase was so slow that it was just impossible to speculate about. And because of that, then you're not really using extrapolation, but you're using just more like what do I fantasize about the future? Not, what do I realistically imagine being the future? And so that gets into an interesting divide with fantasy. So I would make the argument that another reason that Frankenstein is the first technological science fiction novel is because at that point we'd seen now technological progress at a rate sufficient to allow extrapolation of what could come next. I also want to talk about whether or not science fiction speaks to people who are otherwise marginalized. I mean, if we're gonna take as our first novel in this genre a book written by basically a 19-year-old girl in 1815, that's a pretty amazing accomplishment. And frankly, as a sort of liberal multiculturalist who wants to see the pendulum swing the other way, it seems like a pretty good way to start talking about the genre. And when you start looking at the concerns of the next practitioners in the genre, specifically Poe, Melville, and Hawthorne, all of them were very concerned that science fiction was less literary than their mainstream practices. So even among its most early practitioners, as a genre, it was marginalized. And of course, that's hard for us to see because even like the whaling genre that Melville wrote in Moby Dick was virtually unknown at the time of his death and had been panned and so forth. But I've been interested in this correspondence between Hawthorne and Melville, really kind of pushing each other to write this stuff that they both wanted to write, but that they both knew was kind of on the margin and would be more difficult to sell. So it's one of the first places where you see science fiction writers kind of spurring each other on to do some interesting stuff. Okay, I want to go back briefly to the way in which Frankenstein basically anticipates the Industrial Revolution, and I'm going to that fantastic article that I posted in the Facebook group about Blake and the novel and technology, and that begins by talking about a scene in Don Quixote where the deluded would-be knight is listening to the fulling mills. And it's not the famous windmill scene where the machines are visible. He's just hearing the machines, but instead of hearing the machines, he hears the half-articulated groans and snarls of the monster, right? So he can hear in this like early mechanized, precursor of the Industrial Revolution, something ominous. Now, if you didn't, when you saw that Google car in your news feed on Facebook this morning, see something ominous, we're not on the same page. But that's the page I want you to get to. The really awesome thing about Frankenstein and about these sort of right at the early Industrial Revolution is we share a lot of concerns with them. I mean, we can see like all this new technology around us, and we know like okay, we have an iPhone 4S right now, but in 6 months we're going to have an iPhone 6, and we know that after the 6 comes the 7 and the 8, and we know that each one of those is going to be technologically more advanced than its predecessor. Like, that's one part of where we are right now. But while we occupy that place, we also see tensions. We also see things that are worrying us, like what's going to happen to truck drivers when driverless cars become more mainstream. What's going to happen to, in other words, we have a new generation of Luddites who are looking around at the technological innovations, and they should be rising up to smash their automated futures because they're going to be programmed out. So, like living in the Bay Area now, one of the problems that we have is like real estate. Like, where do we live? How do we find a home? Like, how do we coexist as educators, writers, artists, with all these people who are focused on our technological improvement? And how do the people who are focused on our technological improvement bring in the art and the literature and the cultural advancements that are being made outside of that business realm? Like, how do we, reconcile all this stuff? To me, that's really fascinating. And I just, I can't stop thinking about all of the technological stuff that was going on as the book was being written. So, the first steamer is crossing the Atlantic. These early at galvanism and electricity are going on. The early machines are starting not only to be developed, but are starting to replace human workers. Now, the interesting thing is that the workers that they're replacing had really crummy lives, so we don't tend to think sympathetically about what it was like for them to be outmoded. But I don't think we should think it was, some wonderful trip to Disneyland. It was probably just as bad as losing your livelihood nowadays without the social safety net that we have to enjoy nowadays. Okay. I think in the class, after I lectured for a certain point about the book, I think the best way to talk about what Mary Shelley was going to get into would be to have a mock trial. In other words, would be to break the class into two groups, a prosecution and a defense, or a victor team and a fiend team, and both make arguments about who is more morally culpable in these crimes, the murders of Elizabeth, Henry, William. Is it the fiend because it was conducted at his hand, or does the blame lie with Victor, who should have known better and who abandoned his creation? And if that's the sort of analogy that we're going to pursue, what is Mary Shelley telling us about our behavior? Is she saying that we're bad because God isn't paying attention to us? Is that part of it? I can't help but make that connection. And my understanding from what I'm reading is that Mary Shelley was an atheist, even in 1815. It's pretty impressive. It would be interesting to know what she imagined as her atheism, what form that took.
And the book itself has court scenes in it.
It does. Yes, exactly. The book itself has several court scenes, which are, I think, important to talk about. How is morality dispensed? How is it operate in our society? What infrastructure does it hold? Mm-hmm. Now the other interesting to me, and I think we could, really go into great detail. Of course, it'd be easier if I could get easy feedback from you guys. Is what I know is, why is Frankenstein such a transmittable story? Why is it that we can go to basically 9 out of 10 people on the street and say, "Hey, who is Frankenstein?" and they know. And now, second part of that question, why is the story so distorted in popular culture? In other words, why would 9 out of the 10 people that you ask, "Hey, who's Frankenstein?" they're going to respond, "Oh, he's the monster." Right? Why is it that in popular conception the monster and Victor are switched like that? They're juxtaposed, or their roles are reversed. And why is it that in the movie, the 20 imaginings of the thing, the monster's so idiotic, right? The monster's like fire, bad, rawr. Not, I'm cogitating on the works of Milton, and I discovered that, it's actually God's fault. There's none of that, right? It's like once they realized the science behind reanimating corpses, they were like, if you reanimated a corpse, he's not going to be very smart. So that's what we get. But I have to think that there's something else going on. As a Freudian, I think there's something that we're doing unconsciously that we don't even know about. And I'm not even sure what it is, but there's a way in which we can't allow the monster to be Victor. We have to read the monster as the fiend. And maybe that has to do with the way, because the monster doesn't look right. But if you think about the way the monster operates in our popular imagining, in the movies, and in the way we imagine him in our culture, the reason that the monster is morally inadequate is because he was built by a man and not by a god. In other words, his shortcomings have to do with his genesis. In the story, you get this, in the novel, you get the sense that his moral defects are as a result of Victor's moral defects. In other words, it's Victor's abandonment of the fiend that makes the fiend so problematic and evil. His hellish triumph and so forth. So I really think that this is a key question. I think this probably is the key to understanding why the text has such a resonance and such a lifespan outside of its own thing. I can't it's a nut I can't quite crack. I do see the Oedipal notion of like that Victor, that the fiend is like the son of Victor, and so his Oedipal desires to slay the father, and that would have been. Yeah, but that would have been a very interesting thing, because of course Shelley would have been imagining that Oedipal complex without the benefit of Freud having pointed it out. You know, so at that point only Oedipal was there to point that complex out. So that's pretty impressive. But I don't think that if Shelley were here, that she would understand that relationship in a Freudian way.
I felt like she was using that relationship in a more atheistic way, because if you sit there for a second and just try to imagine, oh, what if we just toy with the idea? She's doing this allegorical kind of brushstroke of the victor is God and the monster is us, and this makes the way God feels about us.
Yeah,
you know.
But Victor's also a man, so it's a man's child, essentially, from the point of view. So there's a gender stuff.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, can you guys hear Suhail and Nikita? Okay, if you can't, I apologize. I'll try to repeat what they say if they say anything brilliant. If they don't, I'll just ignore it. But they're here too, and they're helping out. They just made a couple of good points. It is a very interesting thing to think about, especially because then the monster, the fiend, imposes himself between Victor and his bride, right? I'll be with you on your wedding night. Like the one of the things that fiend is going to do is prevent the you know what I mean. The conjugation of the consummation. Thank you, of the marriage, right? So, in some ways, it's another way of thinking about it is like if I don't think we can get too Freudian too fast, but is this a kind of super ego where the monster then becomes a check on what are the desired victor? I think that's a loaded read that borrows too much from stuff that came later. But it's certainly interesting to think about, and it speaks to, you know, there is something good to this novel. Like it may be plotting and it may suffer from its creation and its style, but man, there's some stuff here that's really pretty serious and that we can't just dismiss. Okay. So you know, I've kind of gone through my notes. What I would like to try to figure out to do now is how can we broaden the conversation so that it's not just me, you know, speaking out into the vacuum. How can we try to generate some interactivity in this hangout?
Now,
okay, so
Mike said, now let's go over some of the comments.
Okay, we're going to go over some comments now.
I'm going to go back to filling your spree. Right. Shit disturbing enterprise. Let's go with Nikita's. Mike said, I think the second professor said, okay, we got past that. Starting with chapter 1, is the narrator actually retelling the tale, or was it that was told to him, or are we supposed to forget that after a while?
Oh, that's a good question. I think we're supposed to know that what we're hearing is the telling of Victor's tale by Walton, who's on his way, who's writing to his sister from his Arctic voyage north.
That's a common trope.
And that's a common trope. We got into that of being a part of the Gothic, that these narratives are constructed out of sort of fraudulent or you know, God, what word am I looking for? Sort of fraudulently filled out letters, directives. It's a kind of fictional secondary text, which is really interesting, but it's kind of boring and horrible now. Of course, it's problematic to take out the first 4 chapters in those letters because Mary Shelley's making a clear point that Victor's ambition to create a man is not an unique ambition, that it's very similar to Walton's ambition to get to the North Pole, to discover the secrets of magnetism, right? That this is not just one guy's problem, but a species-wide problem.
Which kind of hints to the sublime to me. Like,
in what way? How does that hint at the sublime?
Because there are these like really intellectually autonomous people that are striving for a point where they kind of hit the critical velocity of their intellectual capacity. Like they want to get somewhere
Yeah.
where you can't learn anymore.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Where it all just opens up and
The snowball rolls down the hill on its own momentum.
yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's almost as if they don't want to be causal agents. It's like they want to sort of conjure this stuff up without agency.
Which is
You know.
mystical. It's mystical.
Well, they want to play God without the responsibility of being God, which
Yeah,
is a
what Victor
moralistic
does.
which is a moralistic way of talking about
Yeah.
where we fail as sort of moral shepherds. I want to talk just briefly. I want to get this term out here. Brian Aldiss says that because Mary Shelley is writing science fiction before the genre itself has kind of been defined, he calls this science fiction. In literature, we tend to think of the text as the original text. Like we don't know what is the Hamlet. You know, who wrote the first version of a play in which the narrator's, or the protagonist's father is killed. You know, we don't know that. We don't know what is the what is the original science fiction novel. Again, but this idea that if you're writing a genre before it has sort of boundaries, that it's science fiction. I like that, and I want you to take that home and think about it.
There's a comment here from Nathaniel going
Yes.
back to your Steph Stevenson commentary.
Okay.
He said the idea of fiction as split between order maintaining and sublime seeking applies to the schism in science fiction with Stevenson et al. Stevenson sees SF as serving science, an order creating and maintaining system, as opposed to a means to gain insight into the human condition.
Thank you, Nathan. Man, that's really good. Absolutely. Yeah, that's right on. And that's really a question of what is the job of science fiction? What is the job of literature in general? Go ahead.
When you talked about the rate of technological development in Shelley's century is so suddenly fast compared to previous century that this context enabled literary speculation, Mike said, is the rate of advancement so rapid today that we can no longer hypothesize?
That's a very interesting question, and I do think that that's an issue, but I also think that one of the ways we've dealt with that is by outsourcing the creation of science fiction to scientists rather than artists. So, for instance, people like David Brin, who have doctorate degrees from Caltech in astrophysics, are writing science fiction rather than some guy who had a really unhappy childhood and a creative writing degree from a city college. Like that person's going to produce better art, but the scientist is going to produce this like blueprint for the future, which is it's like. I was talking to Suhail about this.
R&D.
It's like if science fiction becomes merely R&D for future commodification, the frustrating thing about that is that's what capitalism as a sort of form of commerce does to everything. So as a form of art, here we have this science fiction where it's pointed inwards. It's showing us all this, blurred and refracted, displacement of who we are and what we mean as a human being. And then to take that and to just like outsource it to like, oh wow, maybe one day they'll have a plastic that you can stick in your ear and I don't know what to say to that. That's so retarded. I can't. It's not retarded. It's so. It's so naively optimistic about the human condition, and it's so like blindly believing that science is just like this like wonderful process that's totally separate from the human flaws that take part in it. I mean, God, I don't know what to do with that. And again, I can't imagine that lining up science fiction novels, you'd have anything like a close number of utopias and dystopias. Let's get some other comments. Those are really great, guys. I think I was just speaking out into the blackness of space.
No, they're all starting to pour in.
Awesome.
Daniel asks a kind of literary perspective question, rhetorical but interesting. Whom do we want to represent us in the story, Victor or the monster?
And when you say us, what do you mean? Do you mean humanity as a whole? Do you mean the readers? Do you mean Western values? That's a really interesting question.
Mike suggests that I think in popular culture the man and the monster have become one, that one begat the other. The monster sprang from the mind of Frankenstein, so man is, in a sense, the monster.
So that basically is saying that, no, Frankenstein isn't Frankenstein. Frankenstein is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Right.
Remember?
I
Okay,
see.
so that's not a very, I mean, that's not a long leap, literally. That comes pretty soon afterwards. And if you read that, that's a really interesting thing where both the positive and the negative aspects of the psyche are coming from basically one unit with basically two facets. That's a
The
very,
trope of the double.
yeah,
Form.
that's an interesting way. So in our popular conception, we've conflated the two because they were never really separate. You can't have one without the other. Oh, yeah, I like that very much. I think that's a good point.
One from Mike again, then one from Ted. Mike mentioned to Nikita, Nikita, I agree, when men try to create life, he produces monstrosities. It goes against the laws of nature.
Yeah.
One thing I thought that was interesting about all the like artificial intelligence and life creation stories is people do it, people sexually reproduce all the time, and sometimes the parallels get missed. Like I'm glad the father-child stuff with Frankenstein because it's the oldest biological technology we have in one regard, and then it's like cutting-edge chemistry and physics in another regard.
That's
I
true.
call it technology.
Well, for instance,
Biology.
when I read Frankenstein in grad school, and I went and researched all the various occult ways of making a man. So if you read Paracelsus, his whole thing is take some semen, put it in a cup, put the cup out in the sun for about 6 months. You'll get a little guy in there. Yeah.
Ted Hand made a comment qualifying the genre choices.
Okay, thank
he says,
you.
one worry I have about reading that concerns the concerns of science fiction into one worry I have about reading the concerns of science fiction into Mary Shelley is that she was writing a scary story. There is a sense of irony we have to take into account before we hasten to judge it as a message for or against science. Because she wants it to be scary, like it being a scary story seemed like a priority.
I see. So perhaps she's.
See, he said, and his follow-up was, is a science fiction story always a scary story about science? Can you tell a scary story optimistically?
Well, we are going to see this over and over again with the birthmark. Again, it's like it's hubris. So it's the same quality from Greek tragedy. This idea that you can possess more power than is really realistically granted to you, right? And what happens when you exercise that power? That does seem. I don't want to make the argument that that's every science fiction novel, but that certainly seems to be the fundamental singular concern that these early fictions are born out of. And I read that quote before. I'll read it again. Such shall be the chastisement of that blind curiosity which would transgress those bounds the wisdom of the Creator has prescribed to human knowledge. So it's the hubris of thinking that you can possess godlike knowledge when you are just a mere human. Which is a really interesting thing, because here you are talking about human beings being this unique sort of species that creates, that advances, that evolves, that becomes technological, and at the same time you're talking about human beings as like petty and vindictive and vengeful and not particularly forethought, using great forethought.
Daniel just submitted in the context of science and deities. Science replaces God even back in Shelley's view.
Yeah.
Which kind of goes with the naive viewpoint about science that you were elaborating on. What will save us is no longer internal, but bubbling in a beaker somewhere.
Yes, very good. Yeah, so that's one of the interesting things about Enlightenment values was, like, here's science which is designed to counteract all of the, shittiness of basic human beings, like, cognitive bias and all of this stuff, confirmation bias, and all of our dogmas and everything. But does it ever get beyond since science comes out of that, does it ever get beyond those things? I know it's designed to sort of target those shortcomings, but does it ever really move away from there? Do we ever transcend those shortcomings? And I would say no. And that's the sort of the problem is, what is the job of science? If science is just a pursuit of knowledge, well, what's the, and then you're going to the moon and you're landing people on the moon while kids are starving. That no longer seems like the right way to go to me. Then you're advancing knowledge and you're dedicating all your resources to that when people are dying. I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me.
We just got one in from Nathaniel.
Okay.
It says it goes back to the Oedipal and Freudian stuff. It says we become the monster when we can't stop seeking the approval of our parents. We become Frankenstein when we see our children or others in our world as means to our ends instead of individuals worthy of love.
That's interesting, but I guess to play devil's advocate, I would argue is there a way for the fiend to find, could the fiend just go under the bow tree for 40 days and 40 nights and meditate and find enlightenment? That's really the question. Does the fiend possess the ability to sort of out the higher aspects of human nature?
I felt like he was capable of it.
If Victor just loved him enough.
Well, that's where it all goes down. He keeps blaming Victor. It turns into this really boring blame game eventually, where he's like, "Man, if you hadn't screwed me, I would ruin your life."
And why would you want the love of why would you want such shitty love, right?
Yeah.
If your dad is terrible, why would you pine and pine and pine for this terrible love? I just can't wait for you to shower me with this shitty love that
So I guess
sucks.
in some ways he is kind of emotionally oafish.
Yeah, there's
He's kind of blunt and not. His emotions aren't that sophisticated, but they're complex.
Well, one of the things you get from the monster is his incredible isolation, that he has no one with whom he can share tenderness, intimacy.
Yeah, that gets to him.
That really bugs him, and there's nowhere we can find that because of his sort of ugly face. So it's to me, it's I can't help but read this right smack dab up against this kid in Santa Barbara. Feels like he's unattractive to girls and is going to blow him up. We have this notion of there's this recurring trope of I'm too ugly to be loved,
But it's always tied to sex.
But it's always tied to sex, right? Exactly, and it's the intimacy that Victor wants. He's really not even capable of utilizing in any useful way.
The injunction to build a bride was that was the only thing that would have worked.
And that works. The bride is brilliant because that's upping the ante. It's if you're thinking about a 3-act thing, it's
a good progression.
in the second act you're complicating. It's now you find out Darth Vader's father. You know what I mean? It's you're complicating the connections that you made in Act 1. I think that's an important point, absolutely. But I do think Nathan makes a good point that part of the monster's innate humanness and one of his great flaws is his incredible determination to base his worth on what other people think of him. He's clearly a smart guy. He's clearly able to appreciate art and everything, but he's convinced that these people who are perceiving him hideous and those people are correct. He is hideous. You can't look at him, Whereas I think really what the real concept of love does is it changes the way you see somebody, so that you accept somebody even if he is in a charnel house assemblage, right. you accept him for the assemblage of arms and legs and limbs of dead bodies that he is.
Mike reiterated a literary concept that is kind of not pervasive, but he said, thinking you can surpass God's knowledge or naively believing you can control your environment is the path to ruination.
Yeah.
That's the theme.
Whether
for a man or a society.
And we could even a modern piece
he just said the new Godzilla film delivers this very same message.
Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, right? The idea that you could get in there and you could get into your mind and you could change what you know and what you don't know.
Control the elements.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly why people rally around the national security banner, because they want to so badly believe that something can be certain, something can be secure, when it's not. It never is. People just if you just face that, your day might actually be a lot easier.
Can we talk about the subtitle of the book is
Prometheus Unbound?
I wonder. Yeah, I'm going to type that one in.
The knowledge that Frankenstein uncovers is...
What is the parallel?
Well, one of the parallels...
One
of the parallels is that Shelley, at the same time, is writing a poem called Prometheus Bound. So there's a reference, and I don't know enough about that poem to really talk about that, but that's part of it. But the other is that, Prometheus is stealing fire from the gods and bringing technology to man, right? And then for that, he's punished, right? He gets his liver eaten out or whatever. What we're saying here is, here's Prometheus here's Prometheus stealing technology, giving it to humans to create, and here is no retribution from God. Is that the way is that one way to read it?
Well, it does get retribution.
Well, that's a good point, doesn't it? But it's not divine.
creator.
But it's not divine retribution. It's
No,
a
it's all
kind of
short-circuited.
it's kind of karmic. You know, it's kind of like what goes around comes around.
Yeah.
Well, there's this whole there's passages I marked in here
Okay.
that talk about fire actually. There's
Yes,
some
okay.
symbolism, right? The fire of the soul
Mhm.
that the monster talks that
Mhm.
he has in his soul, right? It's very interesting that the book concludes, or it's bookended, in the Arctic, right?
Yeah.
It's the total opposite of fire. It's the cold.
Ah.
That's where this the soul of the monster will be extinguished.
And that's not where they're not going to meet in the in the fires of the bowels of creation.
Right,
This is in like the the cold extent of extinction or something. Yeah, I agree with you there.
And for Frankenstein to build a bride for the monster would be to unleash this fire even further.
Yeah.
So there's passages in here.
Yeah, that's quite good. Yeah, so there's some. Okay, so that's another element of the Prometheus Unbound. Very good.
Nikita asked a good question in a recent comment in relation to Ted's question about scary stories.
Okay.
It says, Ted, your comment on Shelley's intention to create a scary story reminds me of Poe's philosophy of composition, that every story should aim to produce an effect, an emotional response from the reader. What is the effect in Frankenstein? Because fear is one effect, but it's got others.
No, but it's that one where it's the sublime. So it's not just fear, but it's this like fear that is so intense and so bothersome that it otherwise upsets the normal processes of rationality. That's the way you need to fundamentally understand it, I think. And in that way, it kind of gets into early psychoanalysis of, what is beneath the operations of consciousness, what controls the operations of consciousness, what shapes them, what makes them what they are. Can we ask, can people hear both Nikita and Suhail? Just write, we can hear you fine or something as a comment. I'm just curious to see how this is on the other end.
And I've got a Daniel one.
Daniel comment. I'm drinking some water.
Does the question of accomplishing a difficult scientific feat simply because you can and because it advances knowledge fit in? I'm thinking of something like Ice 9, the Vonnegut, where there's no real reason to create it. Is there a reason in Frankenstein beyond the fact that you can, and that it represents a devotion to progress?
That's a pot hitter of a question.
one, yeah.
That's a really interesting question. I'm gonna have to think about that. Can you repeat
I'm
that
gonna
one more
repeat
time?
that one, For 400, does the question, the Daily Double.
There we go.
All right. Does the question of accomplishing a difficult scientific feat simply because you can and because it advances knowledge fit in?
Okay. So the question is, why do you do science? Do you do science like for your own aggrandizement, or do you do science because you want to benefit the fellowship of man? And in this case, science is not practiced to benefit the fellowship of man, but to improve the self, to improve the notion of self, to improve Victor's self-esteem, self-confidence, to give him a sense of purpose. So I would make the argument that that's one of the fundamental problems of the thing, is that rather than acting altruistically, he's acting basically selfishly. He's not trying to make the world a better place. He's just trying to improve his place in it.
Solid. Mike has a rhetorical follow-up to the
Rhetorical.
Not rhetorical, but the question about God, the relationship between man and creator,
Okay.
and man as creator.
Right.
And he says, so the monster wants from Frankenstein what we want from God?
Yeah, I think so. Like the monster wants from Frankenstein acknowledgement,
A mate?
intimacy, friendship, and if you think about, like, there's a certain way in which we cry, where's God? Where's God in our life? We pray to God. For most of us, he doesn't answer. We don't hear his voice. The whole concept that he's based on is that we must believe in him even if we don't have any evidence of his existence. But there's Zizek says something interesting where, in Christianity, when Christ is on the cross, right, and he's like, why hast thou forsaken me? That's the only place in religion where we see a religious figure in our position as human beings, like where we go, God, where are you? And there's just silence, right? There's Homer Simpson says, if you would like me to do this, give me absolutely no sign, right? So, yeah, there's this way in which the monster's evil is inculcated, created by the creator's abandonment, right? Likewise, we're bad, maybe we're flawed because because we're not in contact with our creator. Maybe we're so flawed, our creator was like, those guys, forget them, you know.
Back to the drawing
That
board.
was just a shot in the dark. It didn't work out so well.
I'm going to pick another spiral arm of the galaxy.
Yeah, start over here. But
Roll
yeah,
a little dirt into a ball.
for sure though, but for sure there's what Shelley is doing is saying that the monster's moral failings are a product of Victor's moral failings. That's key. And if you just take that as an analogy and you extrapolate it outwards to our relationship with God, that does seem to be the claim she's making. That we're fucked up because we're out of contact. We're out here on the cross saying, you know, why hast thou forsaken me, Father?
I'm going to put that one in. The monster's moral failings.
Yeah, for the product of Victor's. And in that way, you can really see parenting because, of course, like it's, you know, in pop psychology, it's easy to talk about the abusive parent who then becomes a parent and is, of course, abusive. Right? Instead of like going, oh, it really sucked when Dad hit me when I was a kid, they actually just acted out without really reflecting on what their experience was. In other words, they don't have any empathy about it. And it's really interesting that, of course, we're all a bunch of dickheads, that, you know, Dick's idea of empathy is so portrayed so antithetically in this first novel. Like, here you have, like, what is a man? Okay, well, you make a man, and what's ironic is, of course, that the man isn't empathetic. The creator, the man-creator Victor, isn't empathetic. You know, you could make an argument that the creation, and this would be an interesting study, how able is the fiend to put himself in other people's shoes? He seems, you can almost make the argument he's better at that than Victor is. And if that's the case, there's a pretty interesting message there as well.
In reference to the question, what is the effect of Frankenstein? Nathaniel suggested pessimistic symmetry is the effect of Frankenstein.
Can you dilate on that? Tell us more about that, what you mean by that. Symmetric.
Pessimistic symmetry.
Pessimistic symmetry.
Now, I see symmetry in the story where, like, you know, Walton's craving a friend, and then when you go to Victor's school days, he's craving a friend.
Yeah.
And then when you get to the monster, he's craving a friend.
Yeah.
There's things like that.
But the interesting thing is none of those characters were doing anything rational to replace the friend, you know, to give themselves friends. Rather, they were pursuing these.
They're just wishing.
Well, they were pursuing these goals that were hubristic. They were out of their, you know, purview, their jurisdiction.
They were bordering on abstraction.
Yeah.
They were goals you couldn't even tangibly
right.
realize.
I want to have you know, it's Faustus. I want all the knowledge.
Yeah.
What?
Which reminds me of a concept that I made up as a joke called quantum omnipotence.
Okay.
Which is like, I know everything, I just don't know it all at once.
Oh. Some days I know this. Yeah. I fluctuate rapidly between knowing this and knowing that.
Knowing the mask, but not the velocity.
There you go.
Everything.
All right, we're losing. How many? We got any more comments?
In reference to.
Did we ever get a comment about can they hear you guys?
Yeah, they can hear.
Oh,
everybody
excellent.
can.
Awesome.
I got confirmation of hearing us from Nathaniel, Mike, Daniel, Ted.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's good.
Good deal. Excellent. All right.
Mike Winder added, well, let's put it in reference to the thing about surpassing God's knowledge, the Godzilla movie.
Okay, I got to see that.
He said, and the question of, do we want from God what the monster wants from Frankenstein? He wrote, do you think maybe that's akin to Satan's relationship to God in Paradise Lost, in Milton's Paradise Lost?
Yeah, probably.
The monster reads Paradise.
He does, certainly
Monster,
does. Yeah, and of course, and that's key. And there's some important connections there. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about Paradise Lost to really talk with any kind of expertise about it. So that's the problem with having a master's degree and not a PhD. You know some things about some stuff.
Mike also postulated that maybe horror is the flip side of the sublime.
How would horror would be the flip side of the sublime? Explain that to me.
I'm not sure.
I don't get that. Like a horror.
It's a state of mind where your reason is suspended because it's overstimulated, possibly, in the way that you postulated the sublime.
Yeah, I have a difficult time thinking about horror as a genre. Like it's such a loose confederation.
It's a tool.
I have a difficult time thinking about it as a thing, but that's because I just don't read it very much, you know. But I do think that it's interesting the way in which the Gothic's goal was like different from earlier literatures. Like it wasn't about necessarily knowledge. There was some way in which it was entertaining. There's some way in which you know, it's like literature is for the first time taking the place of like the way kind of we think about TV now, where it's becoming cultural currency and stuff like that. You know?
I'm getting stuff in the feed. Nathaniel responded to a symmetry elaboration. He said, "Symmetry. Victor could have made things better by being a better parent, and the monster by detaching from his obsession. Everybody fails in ways that complement each other."
Ah. And that's all intentional, he thinks?
That's what he's suggesting.
It certainly seems like that's intentional. It certainly seems like Mary Shelley like got a whole bunch of, you know, sort of
where love goes to die.
She put like fluid, you know, she got this water in the towel, you know, and then she's like, how am I going to wring, you know, the maximum amount of water out of this towel? And she, you know, she set up the story in such a way so that there really are some brilliant resonances. For instance, then when I like when Victor becomes like he's in the prison. You've seen Justine there. You've seen the sense, but now he's there. It's like it's this progression of his, you know, being imprisoned by his creation. You know, what his freedoms are being slowly taken away. First, like through a kind of monomaniacal focus, and now through like the circumstances of his life are starting to, you know, kind of corner him.
A short one from Mike, followed by a longer one from Ted.
Yeah.
Mike said, "Looking for love in all the wrong places."
Yeah, it is good. That could be one of the subtitles of the genre.
Oh, another subtitle that he offered for the book was Prometheus. There he goes again. So that's cool.
Or like Prometheus. Whoops.
Ted Hand says, bracketing playing God for a moment.
Okay.
Social systems create man. Frankenstein could be seen as this existential tale written by an atheist using outdated metaphors of God that don't quite mean the same thing to her. But I also see it as having a sort of sociological take on how science constructs this obsessed scientist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about, because the scientist ultimately becomes like the engine of science, and the fuel of that engine is just like weird human passion that's supposed to be the antithesis of science.
Yeah.
Like that's wacky, man.
Knowledge.
Yeah.
That's what they're out to do, right?
But think of it this way, and this came up in a book that's not sci-fi, but let me do the concept instead of the book. The concept is people think of science as something that brings surety to fact.
Yeah.
And it kind of resolves indeterminacy.
Yep.
But science's very nature is to postulate hypotheses and questions and to speculate about the nature of everything it sees. So it actually multiplies indeterminacy. It doesn't it doesn't create more clarity.
No, it can only determine like what is it like this?
Right.
Kind of. Is it like this?
Maybe.
Sort of.
The basis of science, though, is reproducibility.
Yeah.
It's being able to prove your whatever hypothesis by observable.
Yeah. Isolating the variables.
The reproducibility of the experiment is what drives all the scientific knowledge. And it's interesting, Frankenstein's refusal to reproduce his experiment.
That's right.
To even to give it a name that it's,
or to teach it to anybody else.
Yeah.
That it's registered.
And when they're like, oh yeah, and when he goes to England to study like the foremost things in this field, he doesn't go and say, hey, you know, look at what I studied, here's what I did. Yeah. He doesn't even say like I had a thought about or I've wondered about. Yeah, that's a really interesting comment, Nikita. I've really got to
It's
think
like
about that.
Something doesn't exist almost if it's not named.
Yeah.
It's not, the monster isn't registered in the world even. In
Yeah.
the language itself.
And that's a really important point, like that the scientist refuses to basically acknowledge what he's made. He's so
A
horrified
new
by it.
discovery is a new word.
Yeah.
It's a new term.
Exactly.
So here's
Yeah.
the comment that Nikita wrote on the board in relation to that, what he just mentioned. In chapter 17, the monster talks about fire. This is the Prometheus, again connecting to the Prometheus myth. Prometheus myth. This is a quote from the monster, even though it sounds like the narrator. I swear, he cried, by the sun and by the blue sky of heaven and by the fire of love that burns my heart, that if you grant my prayer while they exist, you shall never behold me again. Frankenstein, this is end quote.
Yeah.
Nikita continues, Frankenstein creates life from death, infuses the monster with the fire of the soul. He denies replicating that fire in failing to create the bride.
Mm.
It's interesting that it ends in the Arctic where love goes to die.
That is
Let's not
interesting.
forget Eskimos, and do you know how we keep warm in Russia?
Okay, a bunch of stuff just came in. Let me
Okay.
catch up here. Yeah, the Eskimos. Here we go. Horror as the extreme of fear. Horror as
That's
a
from
feeling.
earlier.
Mike was saying horror as a feeling, not as a genre.
That's the
He
effect.
clarified.
Oh, okay.
Story.
The effect is to create horror.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
So yeah, that's totally in line with what you elaborated
But
on.
what do you, but like when you say that, like what? God, that's a good.
So
kind
the
of-
stories, the intended feeling according to the Poe model is
Yeah.
that it's supposed to convey horror.
Right.
Just kind of sublime, yeah. I mean,
With
Well,
the
but-
definition we're working with, it kind of.
The interesting thing, though, it's like the horror is all really abstract. I mean, like
Mhm.
Suhal and I were talking about, he never grapples with the monster. He takes a shot at it,
Yeah.
It's like it. He never, they never come.
Never actually attacks. He talks about how much fury and rage he's feeling.
Yeah, but
He
it's
doesn't act.
oh
and it's all told. It's all the telling of the telling.
removed,
actually.
yeah, by proxy. So we're 3 layers back from any kind of action. Yeah.
And Nathaniel describes that kind of conundrum. He says, I think it reflects something of the Gothic worldview, ordered but terrible.
Yeah, that's the really interesting thing that I can't really put my finger on. Is like, are these Gothics like? They're not optimists, know.
No, they're living in in a lot of ways, they're kind of living in like a post-industrial society, like
I would say that. Well,
with the kind of like with the steel industry and and electricity and photography are all just coming to their own during her lifetime.
Sure.
but it's a
The
kind
railroad.
of decay, though, of the kind of a medieval world, right? Of whatever
Yeah, I hear you.
came
Yeah,
before the
totally.
pre-modern world. It's
Yeah.
The
The
black
ghosts of
decay,
that
the
old-
ghosts,
Yeah,
all these
yeah.
old castles are crumbling.
Yeah.
While in the city, slowly the
Mhm.
machine is rising.
Yeah, totally.
But it could. But I mean, it's the Fiend, the sequel, the end of.
Yeah,
the cycle.
And
The new one is starting.
And if it's horror, it's interesting that what Shelley is connecting horror with is progress, which in Western values is like kind of antithetical, we hold those values as like what defines us. I mean, we call that period the Enlightenment because of the great advancements being made, and thinking in
Change is scary too.
yeah.
Daniel submitted. I thought I'd try a definition of horror.
Okay.
It's becoming aware of the fact that things park themselves in your blind spot and grow.
Oh,
like that.
wow, that's very Dickian actually. That's interesting, and it has something to do with the notions of the unconscious and the uncanny and everything.
And with fear in general, right? The scariest thing is that which you cannot see. That
Yeah.
in the
Scariest thing is
shadows, in the
yeah.
fog.
Yeah.
Once it's revealed,
Oh yeah.
once the light of reason hits it, then it's there's nothing to be afraid of. But the scariest monsters in movies are the ones that you don't see.
That's right. It's Jaws. It's
The
the
lamest
fin.
ones
Yeah.
are the ones
Yeah.
that you see. And
Yeah.
so the effect, that desire, that fear, that not
Yeah.
seeing it entirely. Is
Something missing. Yeah, oftentimes just the presence of fear exacerbates it, even if somebody else is feeling it. Even if the fear can be triggered by a complete unknown.
Yeah.
like the silhouette of something that looks like somebody in a hat.
Yeah.
And
Right.
What's somebody doing in that room? And you're like, oh,
Yeah.
wait,
It's a
that's
trace
the lamp.
of something.
Right,
a little
right.
Movement. Curtains.
I wanted to. I forgot something I wanted to mention earlier. Just to talk a little bit about the uncanny valley. Like one of the interesting things here is that it's not the monster's appearance that is uncanny to Victor. It's his personality. That's the uncanny valley. Like it's like when he sees the monster and he's repulsed by it. That's one thing. But the repulsion that he feels when that repulsive looking creature speaks to him in a way that's like rational and even like smart and kind of amazing, like that's when Victor's like head explodes basically with repulsion. Like
whoa.
he's extra repulsed there. So there, I just want to point out that like what's uncanny about the monster is not his visage, but it's his mental process, cogitations, his humanity, his personality. Yeah. That's that works the same way. Like the effect of seeing that being replicated is, holy shit, that's really scary. I want to get the fuck out of here. And it's also interesting that if we're going to talk about horror, and horror is this where the unknown parks, then why would Shelley go to Enlightenment science for what's going to park itself in our unknown? That's a really, I think these are really big questions.
Critique of science.
Yeah, and the only thing I have to say about this is the unfortunate part of this is that this is like grad school shit, and my undergrad students that are going to be taking this class will never. This would go so far over their heads.
Mike has responded to Daniel's fear of something you can't see, the blind spot comment.
Okay.
In chapter 3, Victor is so relieved when he thinks the monster has left.
Yeah.
But we know the monster's coming back.
That's right.
So it's parked in the blind spot.
That's right.
And then Nathaniel responded, that's the tension of science, too. You can clarify what's in front of you, but you don't see what you don't see.
And it's weird how science, like even science has come to realize this, like, we don't know if the cat in the box is alive or not.
Yeah.
It's like science can't, it's like they got this really interesting,
It's alive and
it's this complex of like, well, if I can't see it and I can't measure it, then I can't know it, and that's its whole thing, and that's affecting its state in the first place. Holy shit.
Yeah.
Which means, and it also is a commentary that like science can't afford to just believe something. That's like against the way that it operates. Even though once you get scientific, you can't just believe the cat's alive because it was before you put the box.
That's right. No.
That is unscientific thinking. But there are precepts of science that you have to believe.
Right. Right.
Like the states of matter.
Like causality, like that one
Yeah.
thing leads to that. You tested this, that when you did this and that happened, that it was because you did this that happened. Right,
Yeah.
and that's the thing that science can only looks like that. If you really get, that's why, frankly, I don't think Neil deGrasse Tyson wants to talk about in philosophy, because at the ultimate ends of what you know and you don't know, science has some pretty serious blind spots that doesn't even want to acknowledge. Yeah.
Well, I mean, not to open up a can of worms.
Open up a can of worms, Nikita.
We're going fishing.
I mean, it's in philosophy or Enlightenment, the whole scientific project begins with, Descartes. His Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am.
Yep.
My perceptions are what is out there. They correspond with what is out there.
I am perceiving accurately. Yeah.
And from that, the whole scientific empirical project goes on. But for Descartes, what guarantees this connection?
Yeah.
It's the belief in a benevolent God. There's a belief in the core of science within.
Even on the Cartesian level.
Yeah. Because doesn't he basically say like
it could be a malevolent God, an evil God
that's tricking him? Right.
But my faith is such that I believe it's.
Yeah, and you're basically saying like, well, human perception isn't sufficient to apprehend reality, but that's the best we got. So we're gonna like augment it with a bunch of like little, mind games.
I don't think that there's any kind of there's no structured.
Some really pissed scientists right now. Like, listen to those guys. They're just smoking pot and talking about us.
I don't think that there's
about to bust through the door with their lab coat.
A structured school of human thought that doesn't have its own undefined terms, and those are its faith kernels. Any school of thought has its undefined terms, and those point, line, and plane in geometry are three faiths that you have to have. 3 kernels of faith you have
Mhm.
to make the rest of it work.
Yeah. Causality is when you have to have knowledge
Yeah.
of physics and experimental science. Yeah, it's true.
Trip.
Okay, where's the
Any more stuff?
what's happening here? I'd say we got about another 10 minutes in us. So get your last questions in. I've finished the points I wanted to talk about. I think.
Yeah, I think it's winding down because in the last couple minutes we didn't get a new one. But yeah, do that call for a sci-fi rom-com, The Uncanny Valley Girl. Way to go, Mike.
Yeah, he's on fire tonight. Whoops. Here's the cliff notes. It's pretty good. So what the other question is, would people be? How many people started on chapter 4, and how many people started at the very beginning? And is it necessary to start at the very beginning? And do we have any idea what the differences are between the 1818 text and the 1831 text? And do we have any idea which text we read? See, because I was reading a book that Suhail put together from.
This is 1831.
This is 1831.
Dover edition.
Okay, and I've got 3 editions in my hands now, and there are on Wikipedia it goes through the differences, but I got to figure it out because I was looking through this Penguin edition today, and it seemed like the prose was a lot better, but it could have just been like, man, I don't know. Anyway, the one question we have to figure out before next week is which Edgar Allan Poe story are we going to read? The choices are. The letters of, or no, what are the choices? Valdemar. Oh, here we go. The Tale of the Ragged Mountains, Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, and Malanta Tata are the Poe stories that we have offered to us.
Right.
Anybody?
So I don't, this is the really hard part of the class because this purple prose is just fucking killing me,
I
man.
didn't put water in.
And it's just gonna get worse with the Poe and the Melville. Oh my God, this Melville shit is just about unreadable.
I think you might want to, if we're going to make the whole class of undergrads read Frankenstein, you might want to breeze through some of the more stuff.
Yeah, I know. Well, we definitely, the birthmark is the home run of the one we're going to read this next week. It's the easiest to connect to Frankenstein. All right. Well, I'm gonna do some research tomorrow, unless we're getting answers about which Poe book we should read.
The third one.
Okay, Melanta Tata. That has the coolest name. All right. And then it was interesting. There's a Melville story that is mentioned in the article that I posted about Blake and technology, and I haven't been able to find it in my anthologies, but it sounds really interesting because it's a story of a guy who's basically sublimed out looking at this machine doing this strange operation. So it seems really relevant to the themes that we're talking about, but I have no idea whether it's any good, how easy it is to find. So that's my first order of business for tomorrow. I guess I'd just tell the gang to keep checking the site, and by tomorrow I'll have the list of the 3 stories. And I'm hoping that basically we'll do about 3 stories a week.
And nobody mentioned which version they were reading. Mike Winder said he started at the beginning, which is why he didn't finish.
I started at the beginning and I finished, Mike.
But he downloaded the Kindle version from Amazon with the most stars.
Okay.
I downloaded the free LibriVox audiobook.
Yeah, it's a really, this is a fascinating kind of what are we reading? Or is this the first folio? Blah, blah, and how significant are the changes?
How significant is it?
I do know that it makes a difference about how Elizabeth is established in the order of the family and her role and so forth, but they're not made.
Yeah, I think that some of the tertiary character threads are fleshed out, but they're the sort of
his mother, more family.
Well, anyway, I'll do some research. So I'm gonna get them. I'll name the 3 stories. We'll do 3 stories or 1 novel a week, and the reason for that is because we're going to read more this summer than my students are going to read. We're going to find the best stuff and the most sort of concentrated stuff, and the other stuff we can talk about in reference, but we won't have to read. All right, what are the last comments?
The last thought. Oh, is anybody voting on which Edgar Allan Poe story?
We've got. Well, yeah. If you want to vote, if you've read them.
Toss out
a vote. Yeah, please, if you have a good suggestion. The other question is, do we want to take another week and do? We have Jack London. We have
He's got one set in San Francisco.
we have Mark Twain.
like post a plague wasteland in San Francisco.
There's a lot more of what they call this 19th century, like pre-radium age science fiction. Well, I'm gonna have to sort of fiddle with this, but first of all, this was great. I thought it was going to be really hard to do. It was thanks Suhail and Nikita for keeping it lively in the room.
I think next week it'll be easier because we'll know what we're doing.
We'll know what we're doing next week. We'll get better Wi-Fi. We'll focus more on that. Maybe we can all sit in a row so that the one camera can capture all of us.
Yeah, that'll be good.
And what would be really great is if we could figure out how we could see the people that are tuning in.
I know there's a way to
there
do
has to be.
Hangouts.
We'll figure this out.
There's a way to do Hangouts where you see everybody's face on the video, but I think you have to do it through your Gmail inbox. So what we'll ask everybody to do is go to their Gmail inbox and we'll start a call with them.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll try to keep it as.
Add one another.
Yeah.
Well, if you put all their names in your call and do it,
okay. Well, we'll figure it out, but we'll do some
Either way,
experimenting.
be logged into Gmail and Google Plus this time, same time next week.
Same time next week, and we'll talk about the 3 stories. And again, thanks for bearing with me. It was great, and thanks for these great comments. It's really awesome. Now, the other question is, I don't know if then this becomes a video that they can just watch on the internet or what. I'm going to try to convert it to that. I hope I just don't lose it.
We got a couple. Mike said Ragged Mountain. He doesn't know any of them, but Ragged Mountain sounds cool.
Yeah. I looked at them. They're all kind of interminable. They just go on and on, and you've got way more than them. And there's others, it's like there's Jules Verne, there's Lovecraft. I mean, you could really get bogged down. And the more I look at the precursors, the more I think, boy, there's a whole class that you could do about the precursors. You got to do some Poe, yeah. You got to do some. Don't you know Poe?
Nathaniel suggested. I think Shelley's life circumstances, particularly her education and women's issues, including her parents' lives and work, should inform how we read the work.
Yeah, there's been some readings of that. Like one way that it sort of complicates the reading is like, she had all of these siblings from parents that had died. So there were these weird, like, sort of creatorless, echoes, yeah.
But I think a lot of that stuff could inform how many bits of Shelley have leaked into the text, and a lot about like the literary devices. But it's not. I don't think those sorts of questions advance the themes you've already selected for the science fiction core.
Yeah.
This is definitely a science fictional reading of Mary Shelley.
Yeah.
And Frankenstein could also be a young adult novel.
Yeah.
Like there's something about the emotional turmoil of the peers and the school days and all that that could easily be a YA novel. So you're specifically doing a sci-fi reading of.
Yeah. And specifically, like the themes that we're looking at is hubris, the stepping outside the bounds, and the sublime. When I saw this class was created by a professor at San Francisco State, and now she sort of passed it on to me. And when I saw her teach it, basically the fundamental theme that tied the whole thing together was sublime. So I think that's I'm going to try to use that. I'm going to bring in my own stuff, but I really want to kind of keep that at the center because I really think that that's fairly key. And when it gets too far from the central purpose of the fiction, that's when the fiction isn't as good. So anyway, that's all good stuff. Any other comments?
The last comment is Mike saying this was awesome.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you guys liked it. It was
really
fun.
Enjoyed it, says Daniel. Thank you.
All right.
Cool. This was great. Thanks, guys. Nathaniel brings it in.
All right. Well, that was awesome. So next week, 3 more. We'll hit it up, and again, we'll try to get it started a little sooner with a little.
As soon as you can. Jim.
Absolutely. All right, brothers.
Have a good night.
Later on.
All right.
There you go.
All right, now I'm going to stop broadcast. Here we go.